Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fall kickoff of our The Future is Intersectional, Black Women Interrogating Technology series. We began this series back in March of this year with an amazing talk from Dr. Ruha Benjamin, our Spelman alumna. And we are excited to be able to resume that talk with our speaker today, Dr. Safiya Noble. She will be in conversation with our wonderful Spelman sister, Princess Samson, a senior computer science major, and I can't wait to hear their discussion. A few housekeeping rules before I turn it over to them. Number one is we wanted this to feel like a conversation today, so please make sure that you take advantage of the chat and keep the conversation going during the chat. If you have questions, you can put those in the chat, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you are brave, we're welcome to have you unmic yourself, but you're also welcome to just put the chat messages. And with that, I will turn it over to Princess and Dr. Noble.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning. Hi, Dr. Noble.
Hi, Princess. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Excited to be here with you.
Me too.
I apologize. Let me just pin Princess really quickly, and then we will be good to go. There we go. You're welcome to it, ladies.
Okay. So, or were you gonna say something? Okay. I guess, we briefly had kind of like introductions, but do you want to kind of introduce yourself and your work, Dr. Noble?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. First, I just want to say thanks for the invitation to be with you. I have always been a big fan of Spelman. My best friend and I both applied to Spelman when we were freshmen about 1,000,000 years ago, truly before most people on this call were born, I imagine. And which is, always been a bitter pill for us that we never went to Spelman. So I'll just say that this is the closest that we've been to getting to hang out with the genius of the women of Spelman. So I just want to say I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I am joining you this morning from Los Angeles, where I live and work on the Tonga and Gabrielino people's land, which is unceded, and struggle in this space around the kinds of issues of equity that and sovereignty and justice that many people are contending with all over the world. And this is a place that is also fraught politically, morally, economically. And so I am not on campus. We still have kind of limits to our ability to go on campus at UCLA. But I do work as an associate professor at UCLA in the departments of gender studies and African American studies. And I've spent most of my career in departments of information studies, communications, media studies, cinema studies, and so forth. And I am really grateful to finally have all of my kind of work located in a gender studies and African American studies departments, and to think about the kinds of things we'll be talking about today from those vantage points. I also co-direct and co-founded the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, which is, I think, what we think of as a kind of a feminist critical race outpost for people who are interested in studying the internet critically with kind of a variety of different power analyses. And I think our work is mostly characterized by trying to study the dark side of the internet, or the kind of the most harmful dimensions of the internet. And we have many researchers. We actually have a deep commitment to working with HBCUs at UCLA. So we've been trying to think about partnerships that we could stand up between Spelman and UCLA in particular for students who want to continue on in graduate study at UCLA, so that maybe that's something we can bookmark for the future as well. But we're really thrilled to be co-sponsors of this series with you and partners with you in this series, and part of the community of people that are a part of this incredible series. So thanks for inviting me today.
Yes, absolutely. And I can also briefly introduce myself before we get further into our discussion. So my name is Princess Samson. I'm a graduating senior from Atlanta, Georgia, double majoring in computer science and comparative women's studies. So I'm interested in social computing and algorithm bias and kind of the intersection of like society and technology. But I'm also interested in identity, especially for, Black people, people of color, queer people, and how that intersects with the ways that we use the technology to try to liberate ourselves. Yeah, that's me.
That's great. So I know we're having this fireside chat, and there's no fire here.
I know.
But would have been nice to be together somewhere in some comfy chairs.
We
but
I'm we have to
imagine
the YouTube video with the flames that do the 7-hour Yule log video.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, and as we're continuing to talk, I feel like I'm as someone who's familiar with your work, I kind of see you kind of approaching it at a very high level. But the point of this chat, I think, is to both get deep, but also talk maybe about aspects of your work that you might not always talk about when you're discussing, especially in a space like Spelman, which is created for Black women. And Spelman is a space too. It's like, even if you don't go to Spelman, I say Spelman is your home. Spelman is a home for all Black women, regardless of whether you just got here or you went here or you're trying to get here. But my kind of first question to jumpstart Spelman is home for everybody. Thank you. But to jumpstart our discussion, I kind of want to ask, if you had to, I don't know how many people here are familiar with like the concept on the internet of like explaining something to a 5-year-old. Like, can you explain it like you're explaining it to a 5-year-old? So if you had to explain algorithms of oppression, the false neutrality of like socio-technical systems, algorithmic bias, all the things that we're seeing happening now, with Facebook and Section 240 and 230 and Sesta Fosta, all these things that are swirling when it comes to thinking about the internet and identity and how it affects us socially, politically, and economically, how would you explain all that to a 5-year-old? Because
that's a great question. No, I love it.
Yeah.
I do. And believe it or not, I still am explaining that concept in very basic ways to lots of people. Because these concepts that we're going to be talking about today are actually, they feel, maybe you and I feel more comfortable with them, but there's still a lot of people in the world who can't explain the kinds of experiences they are having online, but they know something is amiss. All right, so let me start, let's say, at the point at which I entered this conversation about the kind of intersection of technology and society. I would say it was more than a decade ago now, when I was a graduate student, that the prevailing logic about the internet and computing software and kind of the emerging platforms that are household names today, like Facebook or Google, the prevailing logic a decade ago was that computer code was just math, and math holds no values. Therefore, math cannot be racist or sexist. So it would be impossible for algorithms, which are, as you know, kind of mathematical formulations or instructions that you might give to a computer. Math that you train a computer or program a computer on is value free. There's no way that it could hold any values. Now, this was the prevailing logic at the time that I was graduating from my PhD program in 2012. It was, there was no such thing as an algorithm of oppression conceptually. That didn't exist. I was arguing that kind of like into the void, saying that, yes, of course, we knew the internet was racist. We had these incredible scholars like Lisa Nakamura and Jesse Daniels, Wendy Chun, even Anna Everett, who was studying kind of early Black spaces on the internet and communities on the internet. Siva Vaidyanathan had written this amazing book called The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry. And that came out as I was finishing graduate school. And it definitely conceptually argued that the company had too much power, and its power and control over knowledge was something we should be concerned about. But it was like many books that are written kind of in the space that we're in around kind of technology and society. It was grand. It was like kind of grand theory. It was almost like a universalized way of talking about the internet or society. And and it still was kind of focused on like corporate business practices and the business decisions that the company was making and the kind of power consolidations that were happening. And when I read that book, I was thinking so much about how these were not just the decisions of company executives, but that programmers were encoding at the level of code decisions and values. They were prioritizing. If these conditions are present, do this, don't do that. Pick this group, don't pick that group. Those kinds of things. Kind of so the logic. So in essence, my work was really just about carving out the possibility that algorithms could hold values, that those values could be encoded, and that in the way that they were encoded in something like a search engine, they demonstrated over and over and over again that they were racist, sexist, and ultimately contributed to oppression. And that was really how this term, algorithms of oppression, was invented. I just invented it to describe that technologies can, in fact, harm us, not just because users don't use them correctly, but because they are programmed in ways that can be harmful. And now that seems like common sense.
Exactly. Like I think it's an idea that we are slowly starting to kind of take for granted, even though the language is not that old. Like I think, especially in a Black feminist tradition and in a Black feminist analytic, there's this idea that you spend just as much time working on the language of the world you live in and the language of the problems you're trying to solve, because you can't even, there's a specific quote that's escaping my mind, but there's this idea that you can't even talk about what you're dealing with materially, socially, economically until you have found that language. And so your work is kind of around, we know that there's this thing that's affecting us, but it's like, how do we peel back the layers and kind of, try to figure out what this unnamed thing is, which is what Black women have to do with everything. We have to do it with our experiences online and offline, and our experiences with anything in this world.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that the most expansive ways of understanding the world come, at least, I think, let's just say in the world that I live in the United States, the kind of like most expansive conception of civil rights or human rights or democracy come from Black women's reframing of the problems, our articulation of the problems, our reframing of the problems. And of course, one of the things we have to do is like scaffold up those concepts with lots and lots of evidence to kind of make a case for what we're talking about. And I definitely felt that with this idea of like an algorithm of oppression, or that algorithms can discriminate. That is, or that did that algorithms hold any values? I mean, back then I was saying, like, where is the kind of like ethics and morality of how we talk about these things? Because the profoundly harmful way, the most harmful ways that I was seeing those technologies work was against Black women and girls. So it's like, just to declare it in our words is never sufficient either. Like we truly have to spend a decade or more organizing, proving, showing, conceptualizing, making legible the claims that we're making, which of course is historically accurate on lots of fronts. We have to do that, right? Because Black women, we're often not trusted to articulate reality as we see it, right? Because we live inside the realities that other people create for us, that they think, that are in their images. So I think this is one of the things that is, you're so right to say, like, that even putting a language and evidence to our experiences, but also our worldviews, like, and bringing about new paradigms. I mean, when I think about that, it's like Black women, women of color, LGBTQ people, we actually brought about the paradigm. 10 years ago, it was women of color, LGBTQ, scholars, journalists, and activists who would, many of the students who are on this call might have been, like, let's say in elementary school or something, right? I mean, it's like we were on the front lines of standing up a paradigm that could be made legible, so that now we're in that paradigm trying to do battle and trying to protect ourselves and our communities.
Absolutely. I think too, something else I want to ask you is, that paradigm has been, all that labor has been poured into standing up that paradigm, into having these discussions. Now we can have these day-to-day conversations about, what Facebook is doing. We can stand up and say, I support Dr. Chinda Hebrew in her experiences at Google. Like, we're having those discourses and kind of internalizing, these counter frameworks and kind of bringing them into the way that we look at the world and we look at technology. But even as this conversation is happening and as it's progressing as far as it has, what do you think are the misconceptions that still thrive? What are the mistakes that you still see people making as they're trying to wrap their head around these ideas, even though they may mean the best or have, the best intent at heart?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the case of Timnit, bringing her up is really a good one, because I think that there are now many Black women in particular, and I want to focus on that because I'm not as concerned with what other arguments are going on in the field, because there are many. All right. So I think, well, first of all, we have always had Black women in computing, all right, since the beginning of computing. And this is a misnomer that a lot of people don't understand. We are, I think, in this really interesting moment where we have had humanists and social scientists, which I am part of those communities and consider myself kind of probably more of a humanist, like a historian, but also like a political economist, thinking about the kind of the texture and the contours of community and histories and people, and maybe foregrounding people and looking at technology as like an expression of people, right? Like a medium that we are working with and expressing ourselves through. And there are Black people who are also working in computing, continue to work in computing. And I think those worlds are now starting to just we are in the kind of very early phases of those communities of people talking to each other, or maybe across each other sometimes, right? And not really fully appreciating each other's kinds of disciplinary domains and what we're doing in those spaces. And that's difficult work to do, because I can't be fully conversant with you, Princess, as a computer scientist, because I'm not a computer scientist, right? And so I think that impulse right now is for people who are working in engineering and computing to kind of reach out for social science or humanistic vantage points to think about their work. And we see this, right? I see this with a lot of, I love my colleague, I think of her more like a little sister, I guess, than a colleague, Joy Buolamwini, because, Joy's like come so far. She's so different than she was years ago when I met her in terms of before she like emblematic of kind of the computing side of our work. I think there are people who are really trying to perfect the algorithm, who are like, how do we design better algorithms? How do we design more fair algorithms? How do we make sure, the facial recognition technology sees Black women's faces accurately? And we all argue about these things because there are others of us, I think, like Ruha and I, we would say, like, we should be abolishing facial recognition technologies. We shouldn't be trying to perfect them, right? So this is where like the kind of breadth of the vantage points on kind of what are we doing here exists just among Black people working in this space. And I think that is where we are right now, is we're trying to figure out what are we actually doing, or what are we really talking about? What are the aims, the political aims of our work? And they're very different. If you are trying to perfect algorithms, I think there are social scientists and humanists who would say, like, that's not the project. And if you are just critiquing technology but not making technology, I think engineers would say that's not the point, right? We want to make better technology. So I'm sympathetic to that point of view too. And of course, there are lots of Black women who are working in tech companies who are also really trying to have impact. I mean, my niece works at Twitter, and she's a leading product designer there, and it's because of her we have this like new Twitter, like the Clubhouse type feature in Twitter. I can't remember what it's called. You know what I'm talking about, right? She was the lead Black woman, lead product designer on that, right? So it's like so amazing to see that we also want. And I remember when she was working on that, and she was like, I don't want this to harm women, and I don't want this to harm trans people. And I know that if I make a product, like, that's who I'm foregrounding, is women of color, trans people who are the most likely to be harmed when a new tech is rolled out, right? So it's like, who's asking those questions? I mean, who's putting us out front? So we have to be in the room making products too, and making sure that they're made in the least harmful ways. So I think I feel like that's where we are. And I think we still have a lot of work to do, but it's really exciting that we're kind of able to start to get into the weeds differently. And it's very, very hard. It's hard because I don't think we have the language to speak across domains yet to each other. I think we're just getting our legs. At least I can say I'm just getting my legs and trying to figure out how to sharpen what we're doing, because I come out of an organizing tradition of wanting to sharpen and strengthen our ways of knowing together, rather than doing it differently. I don't know. What do you think? You're entering, you're in it right now. What do you think are the most pressing issues?
Yeah. So what you were speaking to, and kind of how you have that, like, this dialectic, or this, like, this, this tension between, social scientists or humanists and engineers. I think that's part of the reason why I'm a double major. I'm like, well, to do the type of work that I want to do and solve the types of problems I want to solve, I kind of have to be both. Like, that might be the gap in, not necessarily the gap, but that might be something that I can evolve in my generation as a scholar. Like, what does it mean for someone to be both? Someone can be, two-time Amazon intern and a women's studies major. Like, how can you have, those same things in one person? That is kind of something that I'm thinking about with my career, but also too, this idea, is the goal to build it, or is the goal to abolish it? I think that too, because I can write a paper saying this can't be done or shouldn't be done. Not can't. This thing shouldn't be done because it's going to have this outsized effect on these already vulnerable people, from a decolonial women's studies perspective. And then I can go and work on a research project that the goal is to build something to try to help those very same groups of people or include their perspective. So it's like always this tension between, is the point to do things or is the point not to do things? And it's not something where there's like, there's a 10-point plan that's like, we're going to do this and do this and do this and do this, and this is what we want. Like, it's so much more nebulous and complex than that. I think one of the things that I think is the most pressing issues is getting the people who already, is kind of having that like cross-pollination of information. How do you get the people who build these systems to understand, what it means to use them and be marginalized, and what marginalization even is, and what white supremacy and patriarchy and homophobia and transphobia, like what is it to live with these things, and then how do they morph and evolve online? Like, how do you impart that awareness? And then on the people who have those experiences and who care about those things, and are organizing around that work, how do they get this understanding of technology, and in socio-technical systems to be able to say, oh, okay, this is what's happening, or oh, this is how I can use this system or leverage this system, to meet my goals for my people. I think that is what I would say. The same thing you were speaking to, the pressing issue is like the cross-pollination.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I want to say that, we live in a capitalist society in a country that is predicated upon occupation, colonization, enslavement, just like these profound social structures that are dismantleable. I do believe that. And at the same time, everyone has to pay rent or pay their bills and live. And, I think the hyper reductionist way of saying like, well, if you participate in the capitalist economy, or you participate in these kinds of systems that, including academia. There's like talk about a hegemonic, oppressive institution. That's a whole nother fireside chat for another day about how incredibly painful and difficult it is to be a Black woman in academia. So I think that we still have to get up every day, live, work, and do what we do inside this system. And we can also chip away at its oppressive organization, at the oppressive social organization. And so, I'm not a purist in that sense. This is what I'm saying, where it's like, oh, well, I don't think it's exactly as you're kind of trying to talk about, your own life, like working at Amazon and also being at Spelman. That is also a radical act unto itself in terms of engineering and remaking the face of engineering and the world of engineering and the values that are in that field. And I think you have, I think we have to just get up every day and do the best we can where we are, and, try to have as many tools or theories available. The great thing about, I remember a professor once saying to me, the point of studying theory is so that when you have the microphone, like, or everybody, we all turn to you, Princess, which we will, and we say, okay, Princess, what do we do? You have a theory of change, and you're able to enact it. And I think that's actually really different than people who kind of have no theory of change or have no kind of critical analysis of what they're doing. They're just like there to secure the bag at Facebook. And, it's like, hold on, maybe you want to withhold your labor from that and put it in service of something else.
Yeah, absolutely. I am the director of Tech Ops on Spelman's podcast, The Blue Record. And as we're kind of, working on the episodes, we engage a lot with theory, but one of the things we say when we're ideating and producing things and pitching things is critical, not corny. I think it was coined by one of our hosts from last year who graduated. But yeah, critical, not corny, is the goal, and not
Love
critical
that.
as in picky, but critical as in conscious, critical as in aware. Um, so my next question, or kind of a segue into my next question, is so you're an information studies scholar and you're a gender studies scholar, and you say, you're a scholar of information and power. Like you said, we're having these discussions about computing systems that do this binary, classification of people, of information, of everything. But we're also having these conversations about how gender and race are these classifying, social technologies that are constructed and that are programmed into us. So do you think that we can reprogram technology without reprogramming our own code, our own assumptions, and our own essentialism?
That's a great question. I think, well, first of all, I think we do. I think we code differently in different parts of the world, and that different kinds of values are kind of part of
Yeah.
the epistemologies, right? So we are, most Americans, people in the United States, learn how to code in binary classification logics. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And those binaries map quite profoundly and obviously onto racial and gender hierarchies in our society, and I think in class, and other people in other parts of the world think differently, and their computing logics are different, right? So this is where like the kind of movement to kind of decolonize computer science, right? Or to think, about like indigenous ways of knowing or indigenous ways of thinking about computing. And of course, they do this in like at McGill, there's a big indigenous computing center. There's actually a whole First Nations conference that happens every other year around indigenous computing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have, certainly, I have colleagues who are Chinese who work on very complex programming languages that are informed by Taoism, right? Rather than Aristotle and a kind of a racist classification logic around like how to scientifically organize the world and organize Black people to the bottom of that hierarchy of humanity, of even barely being human. And so I think for sure, the values and the worldviews and then the kind of normative ways of seeing the world inform the way in which people produce language, and people produce language to reinforce the worldviews that they hold. And language does do that, and language can also disrupt that. So programming languages, I think, are a really ripe, important space for criticism and for innovation. And this is like Ron Eglash and, people who think about like, fractals and what do the kind of, African and Afrocentric inspired ways of creating patterns. What does that tell us, and what does that provide for us that we otherwise wouldn't know? So yeah, we have to do that work. And I mean, I think it will, I predict that Black people in this country will probably innovate the most important kind of non-hierarchical kinds of programming languages in the future. And that will transform what's possible and what we will make. No doubt. I mean, the problem right now is we're living in this like age of classification, and the kinds of predictive technologies that are being built and deployed are really about classifying from cradle to grave, marking us as data bodies in all kinds of ways in order to predict us into opportunity or foreclose us from participation in all kinds of things. Not just mortgages, but whether you'll go to school, what kind of school you'll go to, whether any social resource will be put into you or your neighborhood or not. And those things are, to me, becoming normative. in ways that will strip us of our agency and our ability to kind of resist or push back. So we have to keep showing and studying how these systems work so that we make it really clear the harm that becomes normalized through those predictive classification technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And what you were saying about just classification, I think too, like, we know that we have this social, especially in the Americas, and in places that have, a specific legacy of chattel slavery, classification serves a purpose. It serves to make money. It serves to make people rich, and it always has. Some of the first databases in this country were databases of enslaved people. Those ship logs, those things, those were tables, those were APIs that, those were data sets that were used to enact certain things on our ancestors.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
yeah, no, were you
No, you say it, you're saying it.
But I also too, I think something that kind of brought a lot of things together for me is I was at this conference in high school, and Megan Smith was speaking. She was the first CTO, Chief Technical Officer of the United States. And she said that Ida B. Wells was a data scientist. And at the time, I was actually like studying Ida B. Wells for my American history class and doing my project on Ida B. Wells. That moment where it's like, oh, okay, this person who I really look up to in this historical ancestral sense, like they were doing work around data. They were doing work with numbers. Like, I think kind of too, in terms of decolonizing how we think about technology, like we need to have this understanding that technology has always had these impacts. Like we've had, the spreadsheets of enslaved people. We had the IBM machines that, could use, census data to find and target Jewish people during the Holocaust. Like technology has always played this role, but we've also always had, like you said, like there have always been people who've been kind of countering those technologies or using other, data-driven methods to try to counter what was happening to people.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, the origin stories of computing, like many things, came at the expense of vulnerable people, of African peoples, the kind of social organization dimensions of computing are old. They're really old. They're not new. They're not revealed by Frances Haugen. They're actually things that have been, to your point. I mean, the role of IBM is really interesting. I'm so glad you brought that up because so many people don't really know that IBM played a very important central role in the Holocaust in the kind of logging of the movement of bodies of people who were sent to concentration camps and to be murdered. And when IBM was confronted, and has over time been confronted, their position, like many tech companies of today, was that we're simply a tool. We're not responsible for the way in which our technologies are used. We're neutral, right? Really always trying to obfuscate their complicity. And I think those are the kinds of things we're dealing precisely with right now with Facebook. And, I would extend to Google and to Twitter, which is to say that these companies are profoundly implicated in, searching for marks and victims that can be exploited in their platforms, organizing white supremacy, organizing people to commit genocide, facilitating, algorithmically boosting and making more visible dangerous activity, criminal racketeering, sex trafficking. I mean, you name it, and yet they, Mark Zuckerberg will still sit before Congress and say, I just want to connect people, right? As if there was no implication to what those connections are, right? Or no consequence to the types of connection. I mean, are you connecting us to people who will murder us? Is that what your goal is? I mean, because that's actually what's happening. So, it's sick, and it's important that we name these processes for what they are, rather than continue to kind of let these companies off the hook with their rhetorics, right? That they're just tools. They're anything but a tool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I'm processing what you said. I'm like, oh wait, I'm supposed to speak.
Yeah.
But that was very powerful and very true. And I think very apt too, because like this talk is called "Where Do We Go From Here," which is after Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, excuse me, and that was a book and a speech, and the full title was. It was the last book he authored before he was killed, and then the full title is "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" In the speech, he said, "Now to answer the question, where do we go from here? We have to honestly recognize where we are now." And in this conversation, we recognized a lot of where we are, although there's so much more that we could go into, so many tangents and avenues that we could take. But from your perspective as someone who's been doing this work for a while, where do you think we go from here, Dr. Noble?
I mean, I think that we're living in times where we have to ask ourselves, and this is one of the things that I say in the book, Algorithms of Oppression. I say, we have more data and technology than ever, and we have more social, political, and economic injustice and inequality to go with it. So the question is, to me, how will we arrest the profiteering from the extraction of every dimension of our human experience and non-human, even for the other inhabitants of the planet beyond us, beyond the humans? How will we arrest the extractive models that, before we kind of socially organize into, a 1% that owns 2/3 of the world's wealth, which is actually what the UK British House of Lords, their study from a couple of years ago argued that by 2030, if we don't change our public policy, the top 1% will own 2/3 of the world's wealth. I keep an eye on things like, universal basic income and some of the propositions that are coming forward that, feel a little bit like the company town with the company store, where all you have to do is, pick up your check and spend it right back into the company. And those kinds of models, I think we should be extremely aware of the role that this sector is playing in exacerbating inequality in the world. And, the industry still has a lock on the discourse that the technology is going to save us, that the AI is going to save us. And I don't think that's true. I think people are where it's at. And that is messy and hard. And when you listen to Rob Reich has this new book out called System Error, and one of the things that I've heard him say, he was like a tech insider, and that's troubling. All right. The work is troubling, like that, it's like writing from the inside. Okay. So I have like a lot of stuff to say about that, but I will say, and a lot of his ideas are kind of supporting like the Eric Schmidt paradigm, who's the CEO of Alphabet. So, but one of the things he said was that he sat with these tech leaders, all of whom whose names we know, and they say, they want a technocratic society that is organized and delivered through technological means, that, of course, the means that they own. And And when they're confronted with how anti-democratic that is, they will say, like, they don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in everybody having a say in their own lives, right? They think that's messy and incoherent. And of course, when I hear words like democracy, I don't think of what maybe most people think of. I think of like the most expansive field of civil rights, which has always been led by Black women. I mean, the contours of the way we understand democracy only exist because Black women have forced the issue around voting, around economic participation, around leadership, around all of the things, inclusion, the ability to read. I mean, you name it. Black women have always been the ones who no one felt needed to be included in those campaigns, those efforts, those movements. And yet we not only forced them more to be more wide and more open, we led them. And so I think that's where we go. I think, if you want to have the most just society, you should be asking Black women how the society should be organized. I legit believe that. I say that everywhere I go. If Black women, if we were given the time, the money, the resources, and the runway that everybody else has been given, we would imagine the world differently. Instead, what we're doing is we kind of live cradle to grave in a defensive posture from the world as other people imagine it. And I think this is one of the reasons why, where we go from here is like, listening to, supporting, empowering, and making more space for Black people's voices.
Right.
Where would you go? Where do you think? Listen, you got more room to go in the future than I do. I'm already like on the. Where should we go? Where do you want us to go?
Where do I want us to go? I'm still trying to figure out where I'm going. But I think what you were just saying, that makes me think about the common behavior collective, and that if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, right, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. And Black women, that category encapsulates so many experiences. It encapsulates so many economic experiences. It encapsulates queerness, encapsulates, gender expansiveness. Black women isn't just a simplistic binary category.
That's right.
It holds so many different things and so many different perspectives. So in terms of where, I think that I don't want to live in a world, where everything is on fire and some corporation is owning everyone's livelihood and, in control of and has some sort of access to everyone's waking hour. I think that it's very much I'm not quite sure where we're going, but I'm not quite fully sure, where we should go, but I know that we don't need to go where we're going. I know that we need to make a turn somewhere or come to a stop and refuel and change directions. I think that's where we should go.
I love that.
Yeah.
I agree.
And then we have some questions coming in.
Okay. Let me open up the chat. I haven't been looking at the chat. Sorry, everyone.
No, this is our question time now, our last few minutes.
Okay.
Let's see. Here, I'll read them and then you can
okay. You pick the ones you want because we might not be able to do them all. Okay.
Yes. So Grace asked, can you speak about the racist and gender biases in computer vision programs for facial recognition, especially the ones used by the police to identify those who committed crime? So predictive policing.
Yeah, I mean, this is, Joy Bolamini, Timnit Jabru, Deb Raji's, incredible work on, their study, Gender Shades, I think helped us understand the challenges of facial recognition. I think, we have, one of the things we have learned from the struggles around facial recognition and to abolish the use of facial recognition by police forces has been that so much of that work has been localized, organized locally. And I think that's a really, really important thing to remember, because a lot of facial recognition, kind of the use of it, the kind of uneven, unfair deployment of it in our communities. I would even extend this to like what I call technologies of policing. So license plate readers, the use of AI and cameras on college campuses. I mean, there are so many ways in which these kinds of technologies are used all over. I think that one of the things that we've learned from trying to ban facial recognition is that we have a lot of power to grab hold of and articulate the contours of the problems in our local, kind of in our city, at our city and county level. And that's really important. So, I mean, there's no doubt we have all the research to show the kind of discriminatory effects of, I mean, computer vision is really interesting because when you talk to some, and Princess, maybe you have this experience, you talk to some computer scientists who work in computer vision, and they're still saying things like, we're trying to figure out if this table is like your table, is this cat like this cat? I mean, it's like so much more crude than we think it is. People think of it as being a very precise kind of technology, but it's a perfect example of like snake oil that you can really pick apart quite quickly to demonstrate to like local officials why these technologies are dangerous and why they should be banned.
Yeah, and there are, models for organizing on the local level to kind of try to counter these technologies. Stop LAPD Spying has done a lot of work in LA around that kind of.
They're incredible.
Yeah. And their work is definitely a model for cities, all over this country and all over the world to kind of stop the deployment of those technologies.
That's right.
I have a question from Kathleen, and I think it came directly to me, but it says, in what ways can Black and Brown end users of technologies shape or reshape end user interfaces? And so how can they shape or reshape the end user interface behaviors and disrupt the assumptions that algorithms make? How can end users drive connections with technology or use technology for individual benefit versus capitalistic benefit?
What do you think?
Do I think?
What do you think?
I think that we have seen technology used for good things. Like, there is something to be said for having a world that is connected in the specific sense of not abstractly being connected, but connected. And I can understand other people's experiences. I can understand, what's going on with, people who are Eritrean. I can understand what's happening in Palestine. I can understand what's happening to another Black community across the country, and kind of, increase my understanding and kind of my understanding of how big the world is, and how many different perspectives there are. I think we've seen that with the Black Lives Matter movement online. We've seen that with the Me Too movement online. So there are definitely models for, but of course, that engagement in the end, that's the way these systems are designed, the engagement still, positive or negative engagement, money is still made, which is very, very problematic. But I don't think that should stop people from, I think that one thing too would be taking things offline. I think that the internet is incredible in terms of how it's made activism and education accessible for people who are not able to, be on the front lines, people who are, don't have that ability or who don't have that capacity. But I think the people who do, once you know what's going on in the world, you should do something about it, even if it's in your local community. And it's really hard for, Meta or Google or whoever to make money off of you talking to your neighbor if you're doing it face to face.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I think to remember is that when we are doing anything, especially organizing on the internet, we're doing it like in the databases of law enforcement directly. So the degree to which we really understand history and like these previous iterations of intelligence gathering by law enforcement or, the state is really important. I mean, COINTELPRO, there's this like meme that travels that like progressive circles around, um, you know, like, how we resisted COINTELPRO. That would have been like my parents' generation resisting COINTELPRO, and then like putting COINTELPRO on your kitchen counter, and it's called Alexa, right? Or it's called Echo, or it's Siri. And so, it's like what we need is to really kind of aggregate, I think, so much of our understanding of structurally what the internet is, even with its affordances. We kind of, I think we have to think about what its consequences are too, and then evaluate the, the tension between those affordances and consequences to see which outweighs the other. I will say, we are in a paradigm right now that, like when I was a kid, I tell this to my students all the time, probably the doctor who gave birth to me was smoking or getting the baby. All right. I'm sure, 100% sure, my mom chain smoked 2 packs of cigarettes in the hospital bed right after she gave birth to me. There's no question. When I say this to my students, they cannot believe what I'm saying. They're like, you're lying. And I'm like, no, actually smoking was everywhere. Like there was actually was nowhere you could go where smoking wasn't going down, including in a delivery room. And what a paradigm shift we've had in like 2 generations around smoking. Now, the tech sector, not only did it hire all the former tobacco lobbyists and executives and strategists to help them, make their products addictive, erect a paradigm where they could make all the kinds of claims that smoking made, which is that, smoking makes you skinny. It's glamorous. It makes you cool. It's worldly, it's cosmopolitan. I mean, they had the white suffragists smoking cigarettes as they were marching in the streets, right? Their product placement. I mean, it was like profound. They stood up and funded all these fake research centers all over the country to put out studies that their products were, safe. 3 out of 4 doctors recommended Camel over Marlboro. I mean, like the whole thing. And all of us who are Gen X and older, we know. And I will tell you that we need that kind of a paradigm shift around big tech, where we can actually understand structurally what is happening so that we can resist both these kind of like immediate harmful, but all these like secondary and tertiary effects of their products too. And I think when we have that, we really will truly be able to figure out if there's anything of value here that we want that isn't on the terms of exploitation, right? Or degradation or harm. And those are the ways, I mean, of course, we could use technology to figure out climate, global warming and other kinds of, climate issues. But we're not really even in a position to think about that because we are really living under, I think, more direct threats of what these technologies are doing in terms of profiling us and remaking the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's very, very different now. But I think that it speaks to, with the example you're using, speaks to the fact that change or better things always seem very much impossible or out of the norm until they happen. And then that's just how we live. But how can we make sure and do the work of making sure that the change that happens is good and toward the world that we want to see?
That's right. That's perfect last words.
Yeah, that is beautiful. So I'm blown away. I'm not only blown away by Dr. Noble, who always is enlightening, but I am just in awe of my Spelman sister, Princess Samson. I know that we have a lot of Spelman students and alumni on this call. Please add your blue hearts to the chat to show our appreciation for our amazing Spelman sister who has represented us so beautifully today in this amazing, enlightening, groundbreaking, moving conversation with Dr. Safiya Noble. I want to thank everybody that joined us today. We have another amazing speaker who's a colleague and friend of Dr. Noble's next week, Dr. Catherine Knight Steele, who will be continuing this conversation around Black feminist technologists. She will be moving this conversation forward. And so I encourage you, I put the link in the chat for that registration. I encourage you to join that. And I want to thank once again, Dr. Noble and Princess for leading this amazing conversation today. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.